Well, welcome to the Pastor and Postmaster podcast, what you wanted to hear in the sermon, but you didn't. And where the academy meets...
Every day?
Every day. That's the line you're playing. Okay.
As a protege, I'm still learning here,
yes.
So.
The Postmaster and our executor, director, producer, they're both down in LA again, but they'll be back with us. We have on here today a friend of ours, Royce Ruiz. Hi, Royce.
Hi.
And Royce is here also from down south from us. That's Fremont. And we're going to feature him. He's a pastor at Redeemer Church. Long connection with my dad actually was the pastor of what was formerly called Hillview Baptist Church in Union City. I had my first practice preaching there, right when I first met my wife. And so anyway, we have a long connection. We had one of our other podcasts that should be up, will be up, can be up, might be up on the Nicaea Conference.
Yeah, but it's also a little awkward for me because this is my former lead pastor and this is my new lead pastor, and I feel like I'm kind of caught in a triangle here. I don't know exactly what to do.
Not to mention the fact that Brody still does a little bit of side work for us too. So
I can't quit you.
The Lord was calling him to a new place. No, definitely wasn't those. He moved.
Yeah.
You moved closer geographically.
Well, he got married.
I did. And when God brings you an amazing woman, you don't wait. You just do it.
No, that's a smart move. A lot of guys are afraid to really take that leap.
Yeah.
And you're still married almost a year later.
Still married
9 months
almost
later.
a year later. And I have all my limbs intact. Everything's good, you know.
That's so great. I know. So yeah, this is kind of cool. We have a good friendship connection here. All of us have gone to Gateway. I teach at Gateway. Our pastors do stuff together. But one of the things we're going to ask Royce about is, I know Royce well as a friend, and so kind of his own history. I know your history. But he has an interesting background because he grew up in a fundamentalist church. And the question, of course, we're going to try to discuss what is a fundamentalist. So why don't you tell us a little bit about, your upbringing?
Yeah, so the quick background for myself. So I don't usually say I grew up in a fundamentalist church. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in a home where church wasn't a part of our lifestyle. We grew up kind of generically American Christian, but I came to faith in middle school through the ministry of a self-professed fundamentalist church in the neighborhood. So they are a independent, fundamental, Bible-believing Baptist church. And that was kind of my introduction to faith and Christianity. I went from there. I went to Bob Jones University for college, which was and is one of the larger, more prominent, modern-day fundamentalist institutions that will self-identify with that term, because obviously that term can be used pejoratively often to refer to people who don't love that term, but there are a group of Christians who actually desire that term. They wear it as a badge of honor, and that's kind of where I came to faith in, and obviously I came out of that movement, and I'm in more of the broad evangelical movement now, but I also, in seminary at Gateway, which was Golden Gate when I started, I did a number of projects that were adjacent to fundamentalism because of interest. So I've read several books, written reports, and kind of dug into the topic a little bit more because the truth is when you dig into the history of fundamentalism, it doesn't always align with what we think of as fundamentalism today. And in fact, I would say, if someone's listening to this conversation, they probably have a lot of ideas about what fundamentalism is. And I would say probably even within this room, there are ideas and preconceptions about what fundamentalism is that might not actually be the distinguishing doctrines of what fundamentalism is. And so I think to have this conversation, it would be really helpful to kind of define what we mean when we say fundamentalism, because it's a word that gets thrown around in lots of different contexts and actually has lots of different meanings. And there's some common threads between those meanings, but for the sake of the conversation, it would be really helpful to kind of define that.
Gosh, if only we had someone who could talk to us about that. Oh, wait, that's what you're supposed to do. So, Yeah, so let's think of this. If you're someone listening and you're like, I've heard fundamentalism, it's usually not a compliment. It's used, obviously, in like popular media to mean lots of things. It could be someone who just has a high view of the Bible, one, takes the Bible literally, and usually that is, of course, dangerous. You'll hear this occasionally. Politicians will say this, different commentators, professors, people like that, your neighbors. But it can also mean someone who you would call just generically a fanatic. That someone who is a religious zealot. It can also mean someone who's like has very traditional views of like the family, like patriarchal.
Well, I'm kind of curious. Why did you leave the movement? I mean, you're still
or have you left the movement?
Yeah, have you left the movement? Do you still hold some of these ideas we're going to talk about here in a few minutes? Do you still hold to them?
Yeah. So.
Have you left?
I left the self-identified fundamentalist movement largely because I came in college and through just study of scriptures, I came to some different conclusions, not always specifically about some of the doctrines that you might specifically associate with fundamentalism, but with the application of how those interplay more broadly with the church. Mm-hmm. And originally I wanted to stay within fundamentalism to help change it, to help reform it. But then I realized as I was raising my son in fundamentalism that there were certain liberties that I was okay not compromising, but I was okay yielding those liberties for my own self and for my wife, but I didn't like raising my kid in those contexts. And so just through prayer, I decided, I don't think my mission should be to work to improve and change fundamentalism.
Or attack the churches.
Yeah. But rather, I'm going to go find a place that fits my theology and practice better. Mm-hmm. And so I left fundamentalism.
But if you have Bob Jones, that is fundamentalist bona fides. Like, but we'll talk about that. But seriously, Bob Jones, though, is kind of like the notorious, or it can be.
It can be.
But what's some of the reasons?
But interestingly, like Bob Jones is a good example of how our preconceived notions of what a fundamentalist is can be thrown off. So a lot of people would identify modern day Christian fundamentalism as like King James only.
Yep.
But Bob Jones is not King James only.
Oh, it's not?
Bob Jones, you can go to the bookstore today and buy English Standard Version Bibles, New American Standard, you can buy other Bible translations. Bob Jones is not King James only, and it never has been. And so this is the example of why the fundamentalist movement is by far the most fractured movement within broader Christianity.
Or divert.
So like hopefully we do some editing.
Pensacola Christian College.
Pensacola Christian College is another large fundamentalist institution
kind of the two
that
chief
is
ones.
King James only. And so Pensacola will not affiliate or associate with Bob Jones.
No way.
They are not friends.
Really?
The popular consciousness, they're kind of together.
Yeah, but they are not. They don't cooperate. Now, there's definitely cross-pollination between like potential students, but as institutions, they are not aligned.
So the professors aren't going to go back and forth.
No.
They're not going to write for each other.
No.
They're not going to edit. Yeah, nothing.
Yeah, so like a professor at Pensacola would not publish through Bob Jones University Press, even though they have a fairly large press, and vice versa.
So even though the world doesn't see them that differently, there's a real stark divide.
There's a strong divide.
Has it always been that? Can you talk a little bit about kind of the origins of what fundamentalism is?
Yeah, I think it's important that we start just with a definition, with some definitions.
Okay.
Because we have a lot of preconceived notions about what fundamentalism might be, and depending on who you're talking to, and even someone who has a lot of knowledge about fundamentalism, it can be something very different. So you will look at some, like, not even Christian, but just generically religious scholars that will talk about fundamentalism as a movement, and they're not talking about Christian fundamentalism, but they're talking about religious fundamentalism. Okay. And religious fundamentalism is seen, broadly speaking, by these types of scholars as a reaction against modernism. And so you have Islamic fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, etc. And so
Hindu fundamentalism.
and these would be people who, I would say it in short, they actually believe that their faith is the faith. They believe that what their religious teachings are
is the true one.
Is the true teaching, and the others are wrong.
And that's what the media jumps in and says, bigot.
Yeah, and
Well, because of that, do you think that they would classify like Catholic or Orthodoxy as fundamentalists?
probably on the highest level. But remember, those churches tend to have a lot of diversity amongst their parishioners and the
they do.
The views of their people at large. So whereas like Catholicism, for example, will have strong and definitive opinions on things like abortion, same-sex marriage, the actual congregations, the parishioners will have significantly varied views on those topics.
Well, the Jesuits did just do a gay marriage. So, all right, we won't talk about that.
Yeah,
Anyway,
we're getting off topic here, but so you have like a view of religious fundamentalism, and that's not what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
But like you can read scholars and read the word fundamentalist, and you need to recognize, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about religious fundamentalism as a phenomenon across all religions, not Christian
sociologically
fundamentalism.
right.
But then you also have within the household of faith, within like Christian scholars, you would have those who would take a more liberal view of the scriptures and would align themselves more with mainline denominations today. And then you would have those who are within broad evangelicalism. And both of those groups will have scholars who discuss the idea of fundamentalism, and they mean something very different. So if we kind of think through just like a brief history of where fundamentalism came from, I think it would be helpful if we frame fundamentalism with two kind of broad camps. And remember, I said fundamentalism is the most fractured movement within Christendom. So I'm going to broadly categorize these things, but these are not monolithic movements. There is much division within them, but I think it's helpful for terms. And so the two terms that I kind of want to identify are historic fundamentalism and modern fundamentalism. Both of these would be terms from an evangelical perspective, as I would like to use them. So fundamentalism arose in the early 1900s as a reaction against modernism. So going back to that secular definition of religious fundamentalism, it is a reaction against modernism. The mainline Christian denominations, particularly in the United States, but also in Europe and around the world, were adopting modernist liberal theology in the way that they would approach the scriptures, would overemphasize a postmillennialism that led towards a development of the social gospel rather than a focus on a salvific gospel.
Why don't you go ahead and tell us, again, two things, postmillennialism and social gospel for our hearers. What are those?
Yeah. So an adjacent issue to fundamentalism that intersects with it is views on the end times, eschatology, and so you have your broad views of kind of dispensational premillennialism, historic premillennialism, amillennialism, postmillennialism. Postmillennialism is a simplistic view of it, but the view that all of these views view that Jesus is coming back one day, but postmillennialism is the idea that, well, Jesus will come when the church has accomplished its mission, and therefore Jesus comes back and
things get better for them.
And things get better. So it's a very optimistic future view, and so it would tend towards, in combination with a liberal theology, a denial of miracles, a lack of confidence in what's within the Bible, a movement that lends itself towards social change.
And the social gospel.
Yeah, feeding the hungry, like doing things that are good, that are objectively good,
better
and we
wages.
would not want to not do. We want to participate in these things. But what essentially resulted was a mission drift where modernists were drifting towards a mission not about reaching the lost with the gospel, but caring for physical needs to usher in this new kingdom. And so you have this controversy between, and this is what I think within Christian fundamentalism is the core theological doctrine. It is a view broadly of the inerrancy of Scripture, that the Bible actually contains the revelation of God himself to us in written form, and carries within it true recordings of how Jesus lived his life, that he was actually born of a virgin, that he actually lived a sinless life,
he was raised from the dead.
He was actually raised from the dead, that the miracles that are recorded of Jesus healing, of feeding 5,000, that those things really happened.
Amen.
So
Amen.
whether you have whether you don't love the term inerrancy or not, if you believe the Bible for this conversation, you're an inerrantist.
So is there a similarity between a literalist and an inerrantist? I just want people to know that there's a difference.
Well, we'll get there,
Okay.
but yes, there's a difference.
Yeah.
But they get conflated, and it's part of the issue. Part of reading scholarship on fundamentalism is hard because not everybody sees the difference, but it is different.
Okay.
So we'll get there in just a moment. So fundamentalism is a reaction against modernism within the mainline denominations. So fundamentalists did something. They separated from the mainline denominations and founded their own denominations, like the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, for example. And this came with a highly influential and important work. There was a 12-volume work published with 90 essays called The Fundamentals that I think started getting published around 1910 and maybe was published over the next several years. And those 90 essays and the teachings in those 12 volumes eventually got distilled down to just kind of like 5 key teachings,
Marks or
fundamentals, that kind of became tests of fellowship. Modern fundamentalists would, rather than say tests of fellowship, they would ask the question, is that a separation issue? Like, is that a reason to separate from? Because remember, those early fundamentalists separated out of the mainline denominations. And I would say that broad evangelicalism today is the spiritual successor of those original fundamentalists. And so in that way, liberal theologians are right to call us, who are not self-proclaimed fundamentalists, they are right to call us fundamentalists, technically.
Because the spirit is still there.
Because we are the successors of that fundamentalism. Because we use the word fundamentalist and evangelical to describe 2 different groups today, but back then they were the same group. And it wasn't until there was a later schism between within the group of evangelicalism / fundamentalism, where you separated out the new evangelicals from the fundamentalists, that you had the birth of what we think of as fundamentalism today. So I would not use this term, but it would be accurate to say I am a historic fundamentalist. So that's why I like to use the term historic fundamentalism.
So you never really left.
So
Yes, man, they're parsing it out.
Yeah.
The distinction between those.
So because I would say this: if you're a Christian and you don't believe that your church should go on a joint mission with Mormons or Jehovah's Witness or
Unitarian church,
or a Unitarian church or a Methodist church that denies the resurrection, then guess what? You're a fundamentalist too, in the historic sense. But that's not what it means today within the church.
And that's not when we say you're not a part of that movement. You're talking about the other details.
Yeah. So because what happened? So you have this rise of evangelicalism / fundamentalism, and then around the 1950s, you have leaders like Ockengay and
Edward Cornell and Carl H. Henry.
That start a council of churches that kind of fundamentalists start saying like, hey, you're making this too broad. And then kind of concurrently with that, you have a rise in the popularity of Billy Graham. So you have like a theological, ecclesiological level, but then you also have a practical, functional, on the ground level with the rise of Billy Graham.
So they were not necessarily a denomination at that point. Like as we think of, like
fundamentalism's never been a denomination.
So there was never like the Missouri Synod for Lutherans or anything but there were churches coming together to kind of try to form a coherent ideology.
Yeah. So if you read the early fundamentalists, you have Presbyterians, you have Methodists, you have Baptists, you have every denomination under the sun.
Say maybe even.
Pretty much everything but like Anglicans and Catholics, because fundamentalism has always been has been a Protestant movement. So it's never been denominational. But the thing is within you still have denominations within it. But come the 1950s, Billy Graham is going around doing these crusades. He's filling sports stadiums. And in particular, the most relevant one of Billy Graham's crusades was the 1957 crusade to New York. So he went to New York, and I think
a lot of Catholics up in New York.
I think it was Madison Square Garden, and he did something. He would, obviously it's expensive to rent a sports stadium. So he would go into a city when he was going to go do a crusade, and he would reach out to all the churches, and he would say, hey, support this crusade. We're going to come in and preach the gospel, and then we're going to send people to your church. And so, it was a cross-denominational movement among fundamentalists / evangelicals. And so, every Presbyterian church, every Methodist church, every Baptist church that preached the gospel would say, okay, yeah, we'll give some money and we'll participate. We'll even help staff it with volunteers.
Yeah, that's how my mom got saved.
Yeah, and then people come and they hear the gospel, and then they respond to the altar call, and then at the end, after they make a profession of faith, they're given a slip of paper that says, go to this church. It's the church in your neighborhood. In 1957, Billy Graham changed some things. He chose to include mainline Protestant churches that it would include liberal theologians who don't believe in miracles, don't believe in the resurrection. He chose to include Catholics and Catholic priests, and even had Catholic priests participate within the structure of the crusade itself. And when that happened,
that was the last straw for them.
There was a group within the evangelicals, the fundamentalists, who said, no, that's not right. You are now associating with false teachers.
So was this monetary for Billy Graham? Is that the reason why he did it? Or was there also ideological things that Billy Graham had kind of broken away from fundamentalism?
Yeah, so I don't know.
Okay.
I wouldn't want to accuse that it was like money driven personally, but I think it may have been the idea of like, hey, I will work with anyone to get anyone to hear the gospel type of thing. Yeah. And so that's how I've always interpreted it, that it was just like, you know what, I don't care if I have to work with this person or this group or that group, as long as I get the ability to preach the gospel to more people, I'm gonna do it.
Yeah.
And
so he became America's pastor. He would never be America's pastor without that.
Yeah. And so you had this group within the then unified but beginning to splinter and fracture fundamentalist evangelical movement that began to say, well, no, now you're doing something new and you're doing something different. You are a neo or new evangelical. And so you had a splitting of the new evangelicals from this other group that now no longer was using the term evangelical. They would just use the word fundamentalist. So you basically had a split where though those terms used to be synonymous, now they mean something different. And here's where we get at. So while fundamentalism's core theological issue has always been inerrancy, its core functional issue has always been separation.
Well, Royce, one of the things that we were going to talk about was what you call, which is not something most evangelicals would call a doctrine, but fundamentalists call it doctrine of separation.
Yeah, the doctrine of separation. And I think I kind of already hinted at the idea that, like, at its core, what fundamentalists call the doctrine of separation is, very Pauline in that, we watch out for false teachers. We protect the sheep from false teachers. We guard against, even from within a local body, we, practice discipline to call people to repentance, and we don't celebrate sin. Like, so at its core, the idea of churches as a church, ecclesiastically, separating from institutions and churches that are compromised on those core issues.
Keep oneself unstained from the world, like James 1:27.
Yeah. And so originally, fundamentalism had those those documents, those 12 booklets that were put out, and there were the kind of those 5 tests of fellowship or separation issues that were
and those 5, by the way, just kind of like distilling it, because this is part of why we did this, is to know what they are. The consensus is, and I do this because I have a church history class and I do this in the test, inerrancy of Scripture, so Scripture's without error, the virgin birth of Christ, so looking at the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke, the substitutionary atonement of Christ, which was opposed to like a love or symbolic,
like Christus Victor or some of the other ones.
Yeah, although primarily it was just what they call an exemplary view. It wasn't even Christus Victor. It was just, they just believed Jesus was an example of love.
Oh, okay, yeah, I know that. Yeah.
And then you have the Christ miracle working power, which of course implies his deity. And then you have the bodily resurrection. Which you can see, these are creedal things. I mean, substitutionary atonement is not. The inerrancy is implied in the creeds, and the other parts are just a part of the ecumenical creeds. So those are the 5.
Yeah, and for the most part, they revolve around inerrancy of Scripture as the core. Because, like, if you're denying like miracles, for example,
you have to deny.
Well, you would have to deny the inerrancy of Scripture in order to deny miracles, in order to deny the virgin birth of Christ, the resurrection, those kinds of things. So that's why I kind of say like inerrancy is the core issue. Yep. But they wrote all these documents, and then they distilled it down to these 5 kind of tests of fellowship. And even when like the OPC was founded, those 5 things were things that elders had to sign on to. That like, we believe these fundamentals. But like as the idea of separation became important, more and more things started to get viewed as quote unquote separation issues. And so,
which we typically associate today.
Yeah. So like today, like a lot of people might say, well, like, oh, fundamentalists, they believe all women should wear dresses and not pants, like that, so that's a fundamentalist thing, or King James onlyism, or no drums or rock music, or premillennial eschatology, or so on and so forth. Like we have these things that like have elevated to, those have become separation issues. And the issue is you had a passionate group of well thought through individuals who advocated for separation from churches and Christian organizations that don't espouse the fundamentals.
They're heretical.
Yeah, but the problem is as that spreads, as that passion is presented at conferences and in seminaries and all of these kinds of things, and pamphlets, then it gets left to local pastors to decide how to apply that within their context.
And trust those local pastors.
And all of a sudden, the number of separation issues grows, and then and so it really came to a head in that split that I was kind of talking about the new evangelicals and the fundamentalists, where what happened is what developed was a doctrine of second degree or even third and fourth degree separation.
What do you mean by that? The degrees of separation?
It's just a Masonic right thing.
Yeah. So like so suppose you have 3 pastors in a town, and or in a room like
we podcasters here.
Yeah. And one pastor decides, Billy Graham has done this thing, I need to separate from him. And then Ryan over here, another pastor in the room is like,
I put my church down.
It's like, well, like, I don't agree with what Billy Graham maybe did, but like, I don't think we need to separate from him. Well, second degree separation would be like, well, now I'm going to separate from Ryan because Ryan doesn't practice separation the way that I do. So
But
now
we're
I'm
still
going to
cool.
tell everybody in town, hey, I don't go to Ryan's church. They're compromised.
And it's not that I'd be a non-believer, but I'm compromised.
You're a disobedient brother.
Yes.
Wow, they have a term for it.
Yeah, disobedient. Well, and within the King James movement, it would be the disobedient brethren.
So, wait, would this require church discipline to amend or some sort of repentance or?
It would basically
Brethren.
because they're not within one local church context.
Yeah.
It would basically require repentance and change by Ryan's church.
A public statement?
But so like that would be second degree separation. But then it gets more complicated because as you just start to do this, as you go down this road, suppose Brody is the pastor of a third church in town, and that third church in town did separate from Billy Graham. I'm like, okay, good job, Brody. But you all, just so you know, Ryan didn't, so you need to separate from him. And then when Brody says, no, I'm not going to separate from Ryan just because he didn't do the same thing I did. Oh, Brody, now I've got to separate from you too.
I'm too pure for thee.
This seems like spiritual manipulation.
Well, so it is a, to look the best on it, it is a desire for purity within the church, protection, all of these kinds of things, but it gets very convoluted because there's drift, both in application of separation by adding these degrees, and then expansion of what separation issues are. Because if you notice, there was nothing in that original list about questionable issues like alcohol use, like skirts and dress and translations. Like none of these kinds of things were in there. But as it grows and as an emphasis on separation grows, these things get added on a church by church basis, and then it just splinters, and everybody's separating from everybody, and so.
So what it means now, and that's why you said some scholars would say dispensationalism, because that has to do with end times. That pessimistic view of world history that culminates in the tribulation. That would be what typically people think, but that wasn't what it always was.
Yeah, so I mean, just to make sure we define dispensationalism briefly, dispensationalism is not a view of the end times, though it has a view of the end times within it. Dispensationalism.
See, I made the mistake. I made the mistake right now. I'm kind of
dispensationalism itself is a system of biblical theology of how you view the scriptures. And this is as opposed to, say, like covenant theology, where we view the scripture through covenants. You would say there are different dispensations of grace throughout, or dispensations of how God deals with
epochs of time,
people, his creation in time. And so the dispensation, according to dispensationalists that we're in right now, would be the church age. And there's a coming millennium, which will be like another dispensation.
And most evangelicals, mainstream Pentecostal, Baptist, non-denom, would be dispensational. They don't even know it, but they probably are.
At least they have been for the better part of the last 100 years.
Or some degree of it.
But dispensationalism, is largely a newer theological viewpoint.
Less than 200 years old.
Yeah, Darby popularized it, I think, in the mid
1830s, I think?
Yeah, like mid-1800s, somewhere in there. But it didn't really catch on until the Scofield Reference Bible came out and started popularizing dispensationalism to the masses. And you've got to remember a couple things. Literacy was growing. So there were more people reading than there had been in previous centuries. Printed material had become affordable. Even when the printing press originally came out, it doesn't mean it was, affordable, but printing was becoming more and more affordable. They were able to mass produce the study Bible. There were no other real study Bibles available that were targeted towards the laity.
Not since the Geneva Bible.
Yeah.
1570.
And so this was like, all of a sudden there's a resource in the hands of everybody. And it was advocating for dispensationalism. And dispensationalism was a theology for the moment. You had a world heading into severe tensions that led to World War I and then eventually led to World War II. But talking about the early
Soviet
1900s,
communism, Maoism.
You have this world that in some ways looks like it's falling apart.
What's changed?
I know.
And you have and you have within that world. Frankly, they're like a Jewish problem. Not that Jewish people are a problem, but like within that world, we saw what eventually happened in the Holocaust and and all of that. Like so, the rise of dispensationalism eventually, I believe, contributed to the establishment of a Jewish state after World War II.
And this is discussed quite in detail.
Well, it's also, you mentioned it earlier, how the mission movement of a lot of these churches, reason why they separated, was because they were more driven to, like you said, like give stuff away, help people instead of spreading the gospel. And that also what led to a lot of that kind of thinking.
Yeah. So you had really by and large in the broad church moved away from like Edwardian style postmillennialism and started to move to the social gospel type of postmillennialism and
secularizing the millennium, basically.
And so here is an alternative, and here's the key. Is because earlier on in this conversation you asked about literal Bible interpretation. So a key characteristic of dispensationalism is that it uses a literal hermeneutic or a literal reading of the Bible. I would, though yes, I do read the Bible and believe it is true, and I don't allegorize the Bible. Mm-hmm. I would say a grammatical historical approach to the Bible is a more appropriate approach to the scriptures than what is meant when dispensationalists say a literal reading of the Bible, because that most manifests itself as very different in the reading of Revelation and end times things.
Time to separate.
Well, but it's such a complex system, and whether you're joining scriptures and separating scriptures, taking them, the eschatology is not something that you can just kind of approach and just say this is exactly what it is.
It is very sophisticated, by the way.
So at the same time that churches and institutions are leaving the mainline denominations over this fundamentalist issue, specifically the issue of the inerrancy of Scripture, at that exact same time, a popularizing of dispensational theology that emphasizes a literal hermeneutic is arising. And so to the untrained ear, you're like, oh, inerrancy, literal Bible, marry those two things together. Yeah. And so within the broad fundamentalist evangelical church, dispensationalism became the default. But I would point out, despite what certain scholars will argue, that dispensationalism is the key doctrine of fundamentalism, there have always been people within fundamentalism that espouse covenant theology rather than dispensational theology,
which is traditional Calvinism,
right?
Yeah. So within the OPC and Presbyterian churches, for example, they're confessional, and a lot of their covenant theology is defined within their confession,
and even like the Reformed Baptists.
Yeah. So it's not the distinguishing characteristic, but there's definitely a lot of overlap, and dispensationalism definitely became, by and large, the prominent biblical hermeneutic as well as system of biblical theology and eschatology, end times theology within the 20th century. And I think that there's some movement away from that, particularly among church leaders under the ages of like 45 or so or 50.
That's true.
So there's a lot of movement away from dispensational theology.
But the Jesus movement was totally locked in on it.
Yeah. And so we might, have certain assumptions of fundamentalism, that certain things like dispensationalism are a fundamental. And the truth is, there are fundamentalists who will separate from people who are not dispensationalists. But dispensationalism is not a teaching that makes someone a fundamentalist, just like being King James only, which when I was in a fundamentalist church, it was not a King James only church.
That really surprised me when you told me that.
Yeah, we were a King James preferred church. So we preached from the King James. That's what we used to memorize. But you could be in there with any translation. And I, as a teenager, I attended a church with the ESV Bible in my hand. I led the youth group as a 20-year-old with the ESV Bible. So we were.
Well, youth pastors are always supposed to be on the cutting edge and a little more hip, with the kids.
ESV came out in 2001, so you were right that time.
Yeah.
You know, one thing about Scofield, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, like Scofield's, a study Bible really like popularized dispensationalism in a way that, it's probably the most, Carl Trueman says, it's the most important literary document of the 20th century. They would never be classified as such because it's just like a study Bible, but more people have read it, and people would think, if you, like when I was growing up, you would have some independent fundamentalist churches that would come outside the high school and hand out material. Oftentimes it was hardcore six-day creationism. That was not a part of Scofield's push in the study Bible.
No,
surprising.
Scofield was a gap theorist. So
what's the gap theory again about creation?
The gap theory is basically that between the in Genesis 1:1, God creates the
heavens
world,
and the earth.
The heavens and earth, and it's formless and void. Period.
Period.
And
That's period.
And then God creates. God says, "Let there be light," and that there's the room for a gap there of hundreds of thousands, millions, billions, trillions of years. It doesn't matter. That's the gap theory, which is a rather unpopular theology today. It's not.
Although C.S. Lewis advocated, just read in Problem of Pain. But it's not popular today. Yeah.
It's not popular today. But that's what
Satan's fall disrupts this creation.
But it's definitely not a 6,000-year-old Earth.
No, but that's what you'd think you would hear it, you'd be like anti-evolution. I have a particular family member, relative that went to the church, and it was like, we're against evolution. That was on the statement.
Yeah, but you're definitely right that the importance of the Scofield Reference Bible can't be understated, particularly obviously within the church. The joke was, if you went to a mainline denomination church, they could say, if they even used the Bible, they would say, take your pew Bible and turn to page 362. And if you went to any other church, they would say, take out your Scofield Reference Bible and turn to page 489. and literally everybody pulls out their Scofield Bible because they had shared pagination. So they were, and so that literally was a thing.
You want to hear something crazy? Both Darby, dispensational, the theologian that formulated it, and Scofield were both Episcopalians.
Really?
Yep. And the point is, we mentioned mainline. Another thing to define mainline denominations, I think there are 7 or 8 of them. United Methodist Church, United Church of Christ, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Episcopal Church, Congregational Church. These used to be, until recently, only 4% of Americans are mainline today. They're the quickest going down. But during this time, they were every American president was an Episcopalian or Presbyterian.
Right.
Liberal theology had its heyday in the 1960s.
Yeah. And you got to remember, the mainline denominations were not always liberal either.
No.
Right.
So certainly not in the way they are today either.
Yeah. So when you go back to the early 1800s, this wasn't. So churches always lag behind theology. So you have, your liberal German theologians advocating for
your pious grandma,
certain things,
the historic Jesus, that type of stuff.
Yeah, that type of stuff. But it trickles into the seminaries, and then it trickles into the pulpits, and then it trickles into the people. And so you lag behind by decades and decades often. But yeah.
So with, and this is still kind of an issue today. People don't really necessarily understand it, but Gavin Ortland's book about theological triage and that triangle of how we fellowship, and it's not as simple as just separating from people, but there are certain things that are kind of important that we fellowship together. Like you said, we're not going to go do a youth encounter with the Muslim or church or Mormon church. Sorry. And so today's or Muslim church. But today's fundamentalism, do they still have? Is it just every church for themselves? Like every church is independent, or do they have kind of a basic understanding of certain things?
So remember, fundamentalism always has been and still is multi-denominational. So just because two groups are fundamentalists doesn't mean that they cooperate with each other. But like, for example, fundamentalist Presbyterians are Presbyterian still. So they have a denomination and they have a presbytery.
Yeah.
So they still, by definition, cooperate with other churches. They will just only cooperate with other Presbyterian churches that are like them in that they're fundamentalists. Now, because of that nature, because of that ecclesiology, and that polity, the Presbyterian fundamentalists tend to have a healthier view of, what are separation issues. I feel like the worst of what fundamentalism can be found within our own family of Baptist and non-denominational and Baptistic churches, because of the autonomy that we have. So within fundamentalism, by and large, within the Baptist world of fundamentalism, there are fellowships that can be fellowships of pastors or churches. So my church was part of the Fundamental Baptist Fellowship. It's now called Fundamental Baptist Fellowship International. Or actually, they might have changed the name recently to Foundations Bible Fellowship, which is interesting. They took the name fundamental out of it. But
Foundations already.
but that was a fellowship of pastors, not a fellowship of churches. But like you have a number of fellowships and cooperation. So they don't do it on their own. Like I went to Bob Jones, which was and is Bob Jones University is a large fundamentalist institution. It's a multi-denominational fundamentalist institution. So I went to school with Presbyterians and Methodists, and probably 85% or more Baptists, but there were other denominations in there. So they don't fully isolate, but they just tend to splinter. So the
unity part is
they just really struggle with unity. Essentially, the idea of separation and protection has superseded the call to unity. And they would argue with that statement. They would say, well, we still pursue unity, but
we just haven't found any fellow travelers.
They just tend to make a lot of things like dress and music and instrumentation in your music and all of those kinds of things tend to get elevated on a local level to separation issues where there's kind of a monolithic, this is what you must believe.
One of the questions I would have, and I mean, I think we probably, we'll probably think of maybe how we can, because how to think of this in a positive way. I hate to say it in such a bland way, but you're not someone who's deconstructing. You're an evangelical pastor. You're not resentful. You still are a Baptist, and so are we. And so the question I think is like, we're obviously all of us have been affected by it positively, we would say, because the mainline denominations they've essentially lost the gospel, right? And they're not only losing it, but they've lost just numbers. People aren't even compelled to do it, even when they embrace the culture. So the question is like, okay, so how do you're not in it, and yet you're not resentful against the movement. What would you say to someone who's navigating where they should go? Like maybe they're in a church like that and you're thinking, here's some good things that you should keep, but the chaff that you should.
Yeah. So I have a deep appreciation for my time in fundamentalism. I think that it has helped me to be discerning in a way that a lot of people who've never been exposed to the movement before, ministry leaders, aren't. But I also think like that's a two-sided coin. It also has caused me to be more cautious than I should be sometimes. And so if someone's in a fundamentalist church, I mean, I would encourage people, and this is approaching a different topic, but I have a high view of church membership and covenant. And so I would not just say, hey, leave your fundamentalist church. Now, if your fundamentalist church is caught up in certain issues, there's definitely breeds of King James onlyism that I think are, I mean, really borderline heretical.
They're weird.
I know that's a strong word, but like there are certain forms of certain doctrines that they may hold that I would say that would warrant leaving that church, but that would be a case-by-case basis. But assuming that the church is relatively healthy, is not making like separation, like that's not what you're preaching from the pulpit every Sunday, you're faithful in gospel witness, you're trying to raise disciples, these kinds of things, I would say like you made a commitment and a covenant, I would talk to your pastors, say, hey, I have some struggles with this, what do you think? But if they're content to let you stay, and you're content to stay and not cause division, I think it'd be good to stay and not cause division, but as appropriate, work to help your church be faithful to what the gospel calls us to do. I don't want to, I mean, we as the church, we need our churches. I don't want to lose them, but I do want our churches to be faithful. So,
and if you're in Union City, there's a church, in Dakota that you go to.
Redeemer of Silicon Valley. It's a beautiful little church. Actually, we were just down there last week. I don't think I've seen a more like traditionally looking, beautified church recently, where it just feels like, it's just very nice and cozy.
So, Royce, we want to talk about just some application, as we talked about. Your experience is a good one from our perspective. You both came to know the Lord in this fundamentalist church, are not a part of it, but you're not just opposing it every single place. You're not resentful, and that's commendable, and it's true, because I've known you for a long time. So what are some things you would take away, some positive things that you would see, and maybe some negative things to be on guard against?
Or how do you think other churches should take some of that fundamentalist mentality and kind of use it to safeguard their own people?
Yeah, I mean, so the popular like almost cliche saying of like, if you don't know, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah,
we obviously
George Santanaya's
we're familiar with that statement, but there is truth in that, and this is what I would say is that coming out of fundamentalism, digging into fundamentalism, studying it, I have a grasp of the history of fundamentalism. And I see its importance. Like it was necessary. What it originally was, historic fundamentalism, was necessary in a moment. What it became unhealthy. We as a church, broadly speaking, don't have a good grasp of our history. We don't know how it was and how it's been. And frankly, when you look at the church on a broad scale today, I think you see different wings of the church moving in a variety of directions that are not healthy. Whether that be on like the kind of the more seeming conservative side of the rise of like Christian nationalism and some of these kinds of ideas and ideals, or whether it be on the more seeming progressive side and the what some would call like woke Christianity or whatever. And frankly, in both of those kind of sides of the coin, I see within those movements a rise of a fundamentalism of their own. And then I'd even go so far as to say like within the truly progressive church, meaning like the churches that would be LGBT affirming and so on and so forth, I see within those churches a rise of a fundamentalist posture. And what I mean when I say that is that they have certain things that have become so important to them that though they may or may not be issues that divide true Christians from true Christians, they have decided that they are important enough to them that they are going to seek to divide. And I think that, like, if we have a grasp of why fundamentalism arose when it did, of how it did, of how they wouldn't use these words, but I'll use these words, of how certain leaders in the early 1900s spoke prophetically or to the church, like, hey, this is wrong, this is not good, this is not healthy, let's have a correction. Then what you end up having is a rise of a negative type of fundamentalist emphasis of separation. But I think that what the church should be able to learn from its history is that guarding purity in a right way is good. So defining what is essential and what's not essential. Deciding that, you know what, I am not going to let my political party and the left-right kind of polarization in our culture infect our churches. And so I don't have like a...
Time to separate from you.
Yeah, I don't have like an exact answer. But what I would say is that I think that as we get a grasp of the last 130 years of the church and the places that it has gone and the movements that have taken place, that fundamentalism, particularly the idea that we are going to guard and protect the church and focus on what's important, that is something that we need today. Because then this is perhaps the most ironic thing, is that a fundamentalist is someone who says the fundamentals of the faith are important. And as long as we agree on the fundamentals, we can cooperate together. That's what a fundamentalist was. And the ironic thing is that fundamentalists have become anything but that. Fundamentalists have become, hey, we look at all of these other issues that are not fundamentals. Like the music you listen to, not a fundamental of the faith. The Bible version you read, not a fundamental of the faith.
Length of the skirt.
Your view of creation, not a fundamental of the faith. Your view of the end times, not a fundamental of the faith. But what are the fundamentals? There are some fundamentals. And one of the reasons why we as a church, you guys mentioned the Nicene Creed conference that we did, that we hosted with Gateway Seminary. One of the reasons why
Apply now.
looking at the creeds is important is because the creeds worked through fundamental doctrines of the faith. And I even think that today, when we look at the younger generation, the younger generation today, the Gen Zers and
Your
those
son is
coming
one of
up
them?
after, they're not satisfied with the same answers that satisfied baby boomers and Gen Xers and even millennials.
Like us.
So like, you deal with certain generations and it's like, well, this is what the Bible teaches. And they're like, okay. And then someone's like, well, why do you believe this? Because the Bible teaches it.
Yeah.
And that's good enough for them. But Gen Zers aren't satisfied with that answer.
They'll check.
Like, why do you
check
believe
them,
the Trinity? Oh, because it's in the Bible. Well, where?
Yeah. Where's the word?
There's these verses. Well, none of those say it. Oh, let's actually let's dig a little deeper. Oh, you know what? There were actually really, really, really smart people who gathered in Nicaea to work out this deal, some of these doctrines, and they did it. And you know what? The same questions that they had, Gen Zers are having those questions. And we should be able to answer them, because what the councils have shown us is that the questions that they have are answerable. They're not unanswerable questions. But we, for a long time as the church, have not done a good job at majoring on the majors. And we haven't done a good job of being able to defend our faith well. And so I think fundamentalism at its core, as a movement within the church to focus on what is essential, the fundamentals, and recognizing that we could have diversity in the non-essentials, that's a message that I think the church needs today. So while I don't use the term for myself to say I'm a historic fundamentalist, I probably would be, technically. And so, and I would say that you guys are too, technically. Though we probably are never going to use these terms.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that'll be the title, Technical Fundamentalist. Well, thank you so much, Royce, for sharing that. I mean, I think that's an important thing. I mean, I think the spirit of fundamentalism in the negative sense is here, but the fundamentals that were fought for are good, and we would be a part of that, historic fundamentalism. So yeah, navigating those are difficult. It is interesting church history that there is an impulse towards a tension between groups that want to purify the church over smaller issues. I mean, Novatians, the Donatists. You have various groups at different times that have tried to separate, and then you have at the same time the unity of the church. So that tension between purity and compromise is a challenge in this life, no matter what your church is.
But it's also worth talking about.
It's worth talking about.
It's not something we can just dismiss. It's something that, as a church, we should be discussing all the time. And in between different denominations and churches and groups, is something that it's a good conversation to have.
And the works of the flesh in Galatians before the fruit of the Spirit, schisms or factions are kind of done that. So
But we're also called to guard our hearts. So that's something that we can't let go either.
Yep. Well, Royce, thank you for your time. Thank you for that. If you have any comments, if you want to share with us, you can always contact us. Let us know, and we'll be with you again soon.
Yeah.
God bless.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Royce. Yeah. Share and subscribe. Bye.